Today we're talking about the Sons of Dorn, looking at the Imperial Fists in 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video I thought we'd talk a bit about the Imperial Fists and how they're faring in the new edition. Comparatively speaking, not a lot of things have changed for the positive for them, despite the decent advantage of being Space Marines in the current meta. First we'll just talk about how the rules changes have affected them, talk about a few units that I could see them using in the future, and look at one example of an army list that I think would have some potential. So to be honest, from the changes from 8th edition to 9th, most of the changes do seem to have been fairly negative for the Imperial Fists. When the Space Marine Codex came out last edition, they were somewhat competitive with Iron Hands for the top spot, with their decent chapter tactic, and their Devastator Doctrine giving them some extra power against vehicles all game long. They were arguably the chapter that was hit the hardest by not having their Doctrine for the entire game, as it is quite a powerful one. Their Ignores Cover rule is still good in 9th, but I'd argue it's perhaps not quite as good as before. There's less light cover about, some of it has been superseded and turned into dense cover, and unless the enemy army has an actual special rule that gives them light cover, certain units such as vehicles and bikes can no longer gain light cover at all, which means that their chapter tactic doesn't have quite as much effect. Also, more line of sight blocking terrain isn't necessarily amazing for a predominantly shooting army. In competitive play in the Grand Tournament missions, Vigilus detachments are no longer allowed, which locks them out of being able to use a very powerful mortal wound spam one on their Centurions. And the points changes haven't been overly helpful either. Both Whirlwinds and Thunderfire cannons have taken a really big hike, and they were some core Imperial Fist units. Centurions are far more expensive than they were. You'll really be paying a premium if you want the Hurricane Bolter and Heavy Bolter Centurions in your list now, which is partly due to the fact that Heavy Bolters themselves have got more expensive, which again is certainly bad news, as they're pretty much the weapon that the Imperial Fist did best with last edition. They trigger the Doctrine for the extra damage against vehicles, while obviously still being very good against anti-infantry with the extra bolt hits on 6s that they get. Jumping up from 10 points to 15 points on vehicles does just make them a little bit less viable on a lot of useful platforms. For their brother's side, overall for the Crimson Fists, the changes to unit coherency, blast weapons, and how models can fight in combat have really hurt hordes, which means they'll be getting their +1 to hit far more rarely. Despite quite a lot of negative changes, I still think that they can still be strong. After all, they are still Space Marines, have access to a load of very powerful units, but they also have some good things in their own right going for them as well. Aside from Crimson Fists and Imperial Fists, no other chapter has quite so much synergy with Bolters, and there are just loads of decent Bolter units in the Space Marine army list. If it's good with a Bolter, then Imperial Fists will make it better. But I still think that ignoring it is a really positive thing still. Some armies can still get it army-wide, such as Admech Shroud's Arm or Raven Guard Space Marines, and it can really reduce the benefit of cover for the enemies. For some of their other options, the Tank Hunter's Stratagem is always reliable, extra wounding against vehicles is great, particularly on first turn for Fists. The Eye of Hypnoth is still a shooting lieutenant in your back pockets for 1 command point, a great relic. And I think close range bolter fire, the stratagem to fire your bolters in melee, might have a bit more relevance this edition, seeing as it's going to be a bit of a fight for objectives, and being able to blaze away with bolters in close combat while remaining in melee is certainly powerful. Tor Garadon, still a very good HQ choice, hits very hard in close combat and gives decent shooting buffs, and if you have a spare character, then that extra Warlord trait for Hand of Dawn can be good for just generating you an extra command point. Overall, I think there are plenty of units that can be very strong with Imperial Fists. One that did see some play in 8th edition were Imperial Fist Inceptors. Now they've actually gone down in points when everything else has gone up, they're just very efficient with those assault bolters. In many chapters they're far less efficient due to the chance of them being locked up in close combat, but with that close range bolter fire stratagem, you could have a unit of 5 Inceptors firing into close combat with them, which is pretty much guaranteed to do some damage to the unit that you're in melee with. For another mixed deep striking threat, we could use Terminators with Storm Bolters and Chain Fists, particularly Tartarus Terminators would catch my eye for that, or potentially use something like Aggressors using Strategic Reserves to get them close. Strategic Reserves was quite a helpful thing for the Imperial Fist, as they hit quite hard, but don't really have all that many options with getting their units up the board to threaten the enemy army at close range. Intercessors and Incursors are very solid in most Space Marine armies, but extra bolter shots and ignore cover are no bad thing to have on them. Incursors can help you be a bit more aggressive and claim some upfield objectives, and Intercessors have some very decent damage output with their various different forms of bolt rifle. While most artillery did go up in points cost, one that didn't get quite as much of a hike was the relic Whirlwind Scorpius. This Forge World datasheet was pretty murderous with the Imperial Fists in 8th, and with a below average points increase, I think they could be taken to the table a bit more. These things just find it very easy to delete whatever they want to shoot at the table, whether that's infantry units, particularly with their blast special rules now. Or first turn they could very easily hunt vehicles, they'd be wounding on 5s typically, though using tank hunters could make that into 4s, and of course they'd have a flat damage 3 in the Imperial Fist doctrine. Both bikes and outriders have fairly decent bolt shooting at range, and can potentially bully some enemy infantry units off objectives. And despite the points hikes, I think there could be room for a large Devastator Centurion unit in strategic reserve. You certainly pay a bit more of a premium for their shooting now, but if you want maximal bolters in one unit, buff it up with various Chapter Masters, Eye of Hypnos and whatever, and maybe use their bolter stratagem for even more extra hits on 6s, then you could certainly delete a sizable proportion of the enemy army in one go. Aside from all these various units, of course we still have generic strong space run units, such as the Relic Contemptor Dreadnought, Eradicators and Grav Devastators, all of which could really help fill out anti-armour and leave out your million bolter shots to take out infantry. All of these guys would very much like the Tank Hunter stratagem as well. +1 to wound is great, particularly on the Grav Devastators for that matter. Combined with Gravitic Amplification, they could potentially be wounding on 4s re-rolling and come down turn 1 with a drop pod for the extra damage. Finally, I just thought I'd run through one idea for an army list. I'm sure this is by no means optimised, but it's just some initial thoughts as to how you might be able to run Imperial Fists in 9th. Skulking at the back of the list, we have our Warlord, who's a Tech Marine with a Storm Bolter and Master of Machines to give 2 Relic Whirlwind Scorpiuses 2+ to hit, and he's also accompanied by a Bike Captain with the Eye of Hypnos for rerolling 1s to wound, and a Power Fist and Storm Bolter for if the enemy get close. These will make these Scorpiuses just ridiculously accurate, and I'd strongly think about using Tank Hunters turn 1 to take down an enemy vehicle target, and then think about moving on to more enemy infantry units in the next few turns. Terrain could be a big factor in keeping them safe. They are pretty fragile in terms of return to enemy fire, so they'd have to be out of line of sight if I possibly could, or outranging the enemy, or maybe just behind dense cover if neither of that is possible. Going first could be a big deal if the opponent has some way to take one of these out. If they're struggling though, then at least the Master of Machines should be able to pile on an extra 3 wounds to one of them each turn. In front of them and holding the main battle line, we have 2 units of 5 Incursors and 3 units of Bolt Rifle Intercessors with Power Fists on the Sergeant. These guys are here for early game objective grabbing, plus bring plenty more bolter shots to the fight, and they all have at least some capacity to tangle in close combat and eliminate some enemy light infantry. Moving up behind them, ideally screened by the Intercessors, we've got 2 units of 3 Eradicators, just to provide some very efficient close range anti-tank units for the next few turns, and again we'd strongly think about using Tank Hunters on them. In reserve we have 2 units of 5 Inceptors and 1 unit of 3. They can start on the board if it makes sense, but they could also be ready to jump down and eliminate some outlying units in the enemy army. There's nothing too massively complicated about 30 strength 5 AP-2 shots in Tactical Doctrine. Depending on what is most important on the game, the reason the captain has the bike is that he could turbo boost to either buff the Inceptors or maybe even the Eradicators, depending on what we most need to attack, and whether or not we might lose one or more of the Scorpius Whirlwinds. Overall, I think that this list should be fairly good at eliminating enemy infantry. They might struggle a bit with anti-armour and could be a bit vulnerable to Alpha Strike if we can't hide those Relic Scorpiuses. We do have a fair amount of bodies and some decent mobility though for trying to score some objectives. So let me know what you think of the Imperial Fist chances in 9th edition down in the comments below. Space Marines are definitely very generically powerful at the moment. It'll be interesting to see which actual chapters step up to the mark and take the top spot as the meta progresses. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we have regular 40k content coming out all the time. And if you have been enjoying my videos, then I'd just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Channel Patreons get to see 1 video per week early, there's regular polls to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and you also get entered into the Auspex Tactics prize giveaway each month with a chance to win some big kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.